The harsh Texas sun beat down on Matthew Harris as he sat astride his dun gelding, studying the distant horizon where heat waves rippled across the barren landscape. 25 years as a Texas Ranger had etched deep lines into his weathered face, each wrinkle holding memories of violence and loss that no man should have to carry. His badge, once worn with fierce pride, now felt heavy against his chest as he scanned the desolate borderlands outside Laredo, searching for signs of the missing children. 3 days had passed since 5 young settlers vanished from their homesteads along the Nueces River. The tracks led south toward contested territory where Apache, Mexican bandits, and American deserters fought their own private wars far from civilization's reach. Harris knew this land like he knew his own scars. Every arroyo, every hidden spring, every treacherous pass where ambush might wait. But this time was different. This time the trail felt wrong. Behind him, hooves crunched on loose rock as Andrew Young, the half-Apache scout, guided his pinto closer. Harris tensed instinctively, his hand drifting toward the colt at his hip. Even after 2 days riding together, he couldn't shake the memory of finding his son David's body after the Apache raid 5 years ago. Young noticed the gesture but said nothing, his dark eyes revealing neither offense nor surprise at the older man's distrust. "Tracks split here," Young said quietly, pointing to where the trail forked around a steep-sided mesa. One group headed east toward Santa Fe. Others continued south. He slipped from his saddle with fluid grace, crouching to study marks Harris's aging eyes could barely see. The children were taken east, but these tracks south. He paused, frowning. Army horses, heavy with extra gear. Harris dismounted with considerably less grace, his joints protesting years of hard riding. He'd seen enough sign in his life to trust Young's reading, though it pained him to admit it. "Army horses mean army men," he growled. "Or men who want us to think they're army." His mind turned to his old regiment, the 4th Cavalry, and dark rumors he'd been hearing about weapons going missing from the arsenal at Fort Clark. Young stood, brushing red dust from his buckskin-clad knees. Unlike many scouts Harris had known, he dressed in a curious blend of white and native ways, cotton shirt and cavalry boots alongside beaded medicine pouch and hawk feathers braided into his long black hair. "Those who took the children want us to follow south," he said, "a false trail to draw us away." "Which means that's exactly where we need to go," Harris replied grimly. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the only way to uncover truth was to spring the trap. "But first we follow the children east. How many horses would you say headed toward Santa Fe?" He squinted at the barely visible tracks, wondering not for the first time how much longer his eyes would serve him in this work. 6 riders leading 3 pack horses," Young answered without hesitation. Children were split between the pack horses, all still alive when they passed here yesterday morning. He pointed to small scuff marks in the dirt. One child fought, dragged their feet. Others walked willingly or were carried. His voice held no emotion, but Harris noticed his jaw tighten slightly. The ranger pulled out his battered pocket watch, a gift from his late wife Grace before the fever took her. Almost noon. "We've got maybe 6 hours of daylight left to make up ground," he said, calculating distances in his head. "Those army tracks south? How many men?" He didn't want to leave any threat at his back, especially if his growing suspicions about their identity proved correct. 8 riders, Young replied, one horse throwing a right front shoe. Another carrying extra weight, probably ammunition from the way it digs in. He stood silent for a moment, head cocked as if listening to the wind. "They want us to think they're Apache. But Apache don't ride in formation, even raiding. These men have military training." Harris nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "John Wright," he muttered, more to himself than Young. His former sergeant had vanished 6 months ago with several other men from the 4th Cavalry, along with a wagon of repeating rifles bound for Fort Davis. Harris had tracked them as far as Amarillo before the trail went cold. Now here they were, playing both sides of a deadly game. "You know these men?" Young asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. He checked his Winchester's action with practiced ease, the well-oiled mechanism clicking softly. The weapon was army issue, but the stock had been adorned with intricate Apache symbols burned into the wood. "Protection prayers," Harris guessed, though he'd never asked. "Knew them once," Harris replied grimly, "before they forgot their oaths." He swung back into the saddle, ignoring protesting muscles. We follow the children first, but those men will answer for this before we're done. The old familiar anger rose in his chest, but he forced it down. Anger made men careless, and he couldn't afford careless. Not with young lives at stake. Young mounted as well, settling into his saddle with the easy grace that made Harris feel every one of his 58 years. The children's trail is clear, he said. We can make good time if we ride hard. He paused, studying Harris with those unnervingly direct eyes. But when we find them, there will be blood. These men you knew. They won't surrender easily. No, Harris agreed, touching his badge unconsciously. They won't. He turned his horse east, toward the distant silhouette of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. But neither will we. The sun climbed higher as they rode, two unlikely partners following a trail of violence and betrayal into the merciless borderlands. Behind them, dust devils danced across their tracks, erasing all signs of passage from the unforgiving earth. The terrain grew steadily more treacherous as they climbed into the foothills, patches of scrub oak giving way to towering ponderosa pines. Harris watched Young navigate the increasingly difficult trail, grudgingly impressed by how the scout read subtle signs invisible to most men. A broken twig here, a displaced stone there. The boy had learned his craft well, though Harris would sooner bite his tongue than admit it. A cold wind whipped down from the peaks, carrying the sharp scent of snow. They'd need to make better time if they hoped to catch up before the weather turned. Already the children had been missing 3 days. Taken from the small homestead outside Amarillo, where their parents lay dead, their bodies arranged in a grotesque tableau that spoke more of calculated terror than simple banditry. Harris had recognized the signature immediately. He'd seen Matthew do similar work during the Apache campaigns. Your friend Matthew, Young said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. He was not always cruel. I remember him from before when I was small. He gave bread to my people sometimes, spoke kind words. The scout's voice held no judgment, just a deep weariness that made him sound far older than his years. What changed him? Harris considered the question as they wound through a narrow canyon, hooves echoing off the weathered walls. War changes men, he said finally. Some more than others. Matthew lost his brother at Rattlesnake Springs. After that. He shrugged, the gesture heavy with unspoken history. Some men get broken inside. They start seeing enemies everywhere. They emerged onto a high ridge overlooking a vast expanse of broken country. In the distance, thin threads of smoke rose from several campfires, Apache camps most likely. Young studied them intently before pointing to a barely visible pass cutting through the western hills. They won't go near the tribal lands, he said. Too many eyes. They'll swing north toward Santa Fe. There's an old trading post 3 days' ride from here. Abandoned now, but the wells still have water. Harris nodded grimly. He knew the place, had helped raid it years ago when gun runners were using it to supply hostile bands. The irony wasn't lost on him. Matthew always did appreciate symmetry, he muttered. Question is, are they meeting buyers there, or just using it as a waypoint? Young's expression darkened. The children slowed them down. If they were just moving weapons, they'd be traveling faster, staying higher in the mountains. No. He shook his head. They have other plans for them. Bad plans. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke. Harris had seen too much frontier justice to harbor many illusions about human nature, but the thought of children being sold like cattle made his trigger finger itch, especially knowing it was his own former brothers-in-arms behind it. They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow, keeping the fire low despite the growing cold. Young took first watch while Harris tried to rest, though sleep proved elusive. His mind kept circling back to his own son, dead these 15 years in another nameless canyon not so different from this one. He wondered, not for the first time, if things might have been different if he'd been there that day instead of chasing glory with Matthew and the others. The moon rose, casting strange shadows through the pine boughs. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, a lonely, haunting sound that seemed to echo the empty places in his heart. Harris rolled onto his side, checking his pistol out of habit. Tomorrow they'd push harder, trying to make up lost time. The children were out there somewhere in the vastness, frightened and alone. He'd failed his own child, but by God and his badge, he wouldn't fail these. Dawn found them already in the saddle, following a trail that grew clearer with each passing mile. Either Matthew was getting careless, or he wanted to be followed. Neither option sat well with Harris. He'd known the man too long to believe in simple mistakes. There would be a reckoning when they caught up, that much was certain. The only question was, who would be left standing when the smoke cleared? The scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Matthew Harris and his young Apache guide, David Wright, followed the winding trail through the rocky canyons north of Laredo. Harris's weathered face bore the deep lines of a man who had spent decades in service as a Texas Ranger, though nowadays his badge felt heavier than ever since losing his son Michael in the Apache Wars 2 years prior. The irony of now relying on an Apache scout wasn't lost on him, but 4 children's lives hung in the balance. David moved with an effortless grace that belied his youth, reading signs in the dust and broken vegetation that were invisible to Harris's aging eyes. The boy couldn't have been more than 20, yet there was an ancient wisdom in the way he studied the landscape. Harris had initially resisted when Captain John Lewis assigned the Apache Scout to help track the missing settler children, but he'd quickly learned to respect David's abilities. The kidnapping had shocked Virginia City 3 days ago. Hannah and Grace King, along with Rebecca and Andrew Young, had vanished from a creek bed where they had been gathering berries. Initial suspicions had fallen on rogue Apache raiders, but David had immediately noticed discrepancies in the tracks. The hoofprints were from military-issue horseshoes, and brass rifle cartridges found at the scene matched Army ammunition. Harris's mind kept returning to a disturbing encounter 2 months back in Santa Fe. He'd run into his old comrade Lieutenant Michael Wright, now discharged, drinking heavily and bitter about the Army's treaties with the tribes. Wright had ranted about making alliances with certain Apache bands, selling them weapons to attack settlers, creating chaos that would force Washington to abandon the peace policies. Harris had dismissed it as drunken rambling at the time. The trail led them into a narrow box canyon where the walls rose like cathedral spires. David suddenly raised his hand in warning, pointing to fresh horse droppings and scattered feed corn, signs of a recent camp. They dismounted and crept forward on foot. Around a bend, voices echoed off the stone walls. Harris recognized one immediately, the harsh bark of Sergeant Andrew King, who'd served in his old regiment before deserting 6 months ago. "The Apache will pay double for these new rifles," King was saying. "Once they hit the Lewis Ranch, the Army will have to respond. Then we'll get paid again supplying both sides." Harris's gut churned at the casual cruelty in King's voice. He'd trained that man, trusted him. Now King was orchestrating attacks on innocent settlers to profit from the bloodshed. The children were likely just pawns in his scheme. David touched Harris's arm and pointed to a natural cave mouth high up the canyon wall. Movement could be seen inside, small figures huddled in the shadows. The children were alive, but getting to them would be nearly impossible with King's men guarding the approach. Harris counted at least 6 rogue soldiers in the camp below, all heavily armed. They'd need a diversion. As if reading his thoughts, David withdrew 4 small clay pots from his saddlebag. "Signal smoke," he whispered. "Different colors. Make them think Apache war party coming." Harris nodded grimly. It was a risk. If real Apache raiders were in the area, the smoke could draw them. But they were running out of options as the sun sank toward the canyon rim. The children had already endured 3 days of captivity. The plan came together quickly. David would plant the smoke pots on the ridgeline while Harris worked his way closer to the cave. When the signals went up, the soldiers would likely split their forces, some riding out to investigate, others staying to guard their prisoners. In the confusion, Harris would have his chance. He tried not to think about the fact that he was trusting his life to an Apache youth while preparing to fight his former brothers-in-arms. As dusk approached, Harris positioned himself behind a boulder with a clear view of both the cave and the canyon floor. His old Sharps rifle felt familiar in his hands, though he prayed he wouldn't have to use it on men he'd once called friends. The first wisps of colored smoke began to curl above the rim, blue, then red, then yellow, right on schedule. He heard King barking orders, boots scrambling on stone. The trap was set. Harris watched as 4 riders emerged from the cave mouth, spurring their horses toward the smoke signals. He recognized Lieutenant King's distinctive gait even from this distance. The man had always sat a horse like he owned it. 3 guards remained behind, their silhouettes visible against the cave's amber glow. Through his scope, Harris could make out their nervous pacing, rifles held ready. The children's soft crying carried on the evening breeze. David had done his part perfectly. Now came the dangerous dance. Harris began working his way closer, using the deepening shadows and scattered boulders for cover. His joints protested the careful movement. He wasn't as limber as he'd been during his ranger days. But decades of tracking had taught him patience. Rush this, and they'd all die. The guards were green but trigger-happy. A child's scream pierced the twilight, followed by harsh male laughter. Harris's finger tightened on his trigger, old rage burning in his chest. He forced himself to breathe slowly, remembering his own son's final moments in Apache territory. Revenge had nearly destroyed him once before. This wasn't about settling old scores. It was about saving innocent lives. He had to stay focused. The sound of gunfire erupted from the ridge where David had placed the smoke pots. The young Apache was creating a convincing diversion, making King's group think they'd found what they were looking for. 2 more guards rushed from the cave, leaving only one behind. Harris smiled grimly. The plan was working better than expected. Now came the truly dangerous part. Moving with agonizing slowness, Harris positioned himself behind a stone outcropping barely 30 yards from the cave entrance. The remaining guard was young, probably one of the new recruits who joined the regiment just before Harris retired. The boy kept glancing nervously between the cave and the distant ridgeline where his companions had disappeared. His inexperience might work in Harris's favor, but it also made him unpredictable. Inside the cave, a child began singing softly, one of the hymns from the Virginia City Church. Harris recognized Rebecca's voice, trying to comfort the younger ones. His chest tightened, remembering how she'd always helped keep the other children in line during Sunday services. They were good kids. They didn't deserve any of this. More than ever, he was glad he'd accepted David's help, despite his initial mistrust. The guard's head snapped around at a sound from deeper in the canyon. Probably a coyote, but it was enough. Harris moved like flowing water, closing the distance in complete silence. His hand found the pressure point on the young soldier's neck, just as he'd learned from an old Apache scout decades ago. The guard crumpled without a sound. Harris caught him before he could fall, easing him quietly to the ground. The cave opening yawned before him, flickering with lantern light. Harris could hear the children's whispered prayers now, smell wood smoke and unwashed bodies. He drew his knife, cut the guard's bonds, and used them to secure the unconscious man. Then he pressed himself against the rough stone wall, inching toward the entrance. Everything hinged on the next few moments. A horse whinnied in the distance, followed by shouts and more gunfire. David was keeping the others busy, but they wouldn't stay distracted forever. Harris took a deep breath, checked his pistol, and prepared to step into the cave. That's when he heard the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked behind his head. A familiar voice spoke softly. "Getting slow in your old age, Matt. Should have known you'd stick your nose in this." Harris's blood ran cold. He knew that voice, had shared campfires and battles with its owner. "Michael," he said quietly, not turning around. "I always wondered if you were involved in this mess." The rifle barrel pressed harder against his skull as his former friend chuckled darkly. "You never could leave well enough alone. Now I've got to decide what to do with you." Harris felt the weight of decades of friendship and betrayal pressing down as heavily as the rifle barrel against his skull. The cave's damp air carried the metallic scent of gunpowder mixed with horse sweat and leather. Outside, the sporadic gunfire had quieted, leaving him to wonder about David's fate. He needed to buy time, keep Michael talking. "Those children didn't deserve this, Michael. Whatever you're mixed up in, there's still a chance to make it right," Harris said, keeping his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. His fingers twitched near his holster, but he knew any sudden movement would be his last. The cave's shadows danced against the walls from the flickering lantern light, creating ghostly shapes that seemed to mock their standoff. "Always the righteous one, weren't you, Matt? Even after what the Apaches did to your boy?" Michael's voice carried an edge of bitterness that hadn't been there in their ranger days. "You don't understand what's really happening here. Those weapons we're selling? They're going to tribes who help us control the border. Keep the wrong sort from crossing. The children were just leverage to keep their parents quiet." A pebble clattered somewhere deeper in the cave, causing both men to tense. Harris caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. David had somehow circled around through another entrance. But the young scout would only have one chance, and if he missed, they'd both die in this cave. The thought of David reminded Harris painfully of his own son, lost to violence that seemed endless out here on the frontier. "I understand well enough," Harris replied, carefully shifting his weight to draw Michael's attention. "You're not controlling anything. You're feeding a fire that'll burn everything down, including those settlers around Amarillo you swore to protect. Remember them, Michael, the ones who trusted us." Through the haze of dawn, Matthew Harris and his young Apache scout Andrew crested the ridge overlooking the narrow canyon where they'd tracked the rogue soldiers. 3 days of following their trail had led them here, deep in contested territory between Santa Fe and Laredo. The aging Texas Ranger's joints ached from the hard riding, but the thought of those kidnapped children kept him pushing forward. His own lost son, David's face, haunted his dreams each night they drew closer. Andrew dismounted silently, pressing his ear to the ground. His eyes met Matthew's with grim certainty. 7 horses passed here before sunrise. They're moving slower now, weighted down. The scout's English was perfect, having been educated at a mission school, though Matthew had initially distrusted him when Captain Lewis assigned them as partners. Now, after weeks on the trail together, that prejudice felt like a lifetime ago. The sound of children crying echoed up from the canyon, followed by harsh male voices. Matthew's hand instinctively went to his Winchester. Through his spyglass, he counted 4 men in faded blue uniforms gathered around a campfire. Soldiers he'd once served with under Colonel John Wright. The same men who'd sworn oaths to protect settlers were now trafficking weapons to hostile tribes, using kidnapped children as leverage in their deals. "There's Rebecca and Hannah," Andrew whispered, pointing to 2 small figures huddled beneath a wagon. The young sisters had been taken from their homestead near Amarillo 3 weeks ago, along with 3 other children from neighboring farms. Their father, Michael Young, had ridden through the night to reach the ranger station, half dead from exhaustion, begging for help. Matthew had recognized the description of the kidnappers immediately. The betrayal cut deep. These were men he'd fought beside, shared meals with, trusted with his life. Sergeant David King, who'd saved Matthew's life at Yellow Creek. Corporal Michael Lewis, who'd carried Matthew's own son's body back after the Apache ambush. Now they were nothing but common bandits, worse than the raiders they'd once hunted. The children were just bargaining chips to them, a way to force the tribes to trade for stolen rifles and ammunition. Andrew touched Matthew's arm, pointing to movement in the rocks above the camp. "Apache scouts, at least 6. They're here for the weapons exchange." The young Indian's face was troubled. "These are my mother's people, but what they do here dishonors us all. The children must be saved." Matthew nodded, knowing they were vastly outnumbered. But he'd made a promise to bring those children home, and he meant to keep it. They formulated their plan as the sun climbed higher. Andrew would create a distraction in the rocks, drawing the Apache scouts away while Matthew used the confusion to reach the children. It was risky. If either of them failed, they'd likely both die. But watching the terrified children through his spyglass, Matthew knew they had no choice. He thought of his son David, how he'd failed to protect him. He wouldn't fail these children. The attack came at noon, when the heat had made the soldiers drowsy and inattentive. Andrew's war cry echoed through the canyon as he sent a cascade of rocks tumbling down one slope. The Apache scouts responded immediately, moving to intercept what they thought was a rival band. Matthew used the chaos to slide down the opposite wall, staying in the shadows as he worked his way toward the wagon. King was the first to spot him, shouting a warning as he reached for his revolver. Matthew's first shot caught him in the chest, spinning him backward into the fire. Lewis and the others scrambled for cover, returning fire as Matthew dove behind a boulder. The children's screams filled the air, mixing with gunfire and the continued sounds of Andrew's distraction in the rocks above. Matthew could only pray the young scout was still alive. The firefight was brutal and close. Matthew took a bullet in his left arm but managed to wound 2 more of his former comrades. When his Winchester ran dry, he drew his Colt, knowing he had to reach the children before the Apache scouts realized they'd been tricked. He could hear them already returning, their angry shouts growing closer. Time was running out. Through the gun smoke, he locked eyes with Michael Lewis, seeing only cold hatred in the face of the man who'd once been like a brother. "It didn't have to be this way," Matthew called out, trying one last time to reach whatever honor might remain in his old friend. Lewis's response was another shot that chipped stone inches from Matthew's head. "You're right," Lewis snarled. "We could have split the profits. Now you'll die here, just like your boy." The words hit harder than any bullet, igniting a rage Matthew hadn't felt since the day he'd buried his son. With a roar, he broke from cover, firing as he charged. The next moments were a blur of smoke and thunder. Matthew felt bullets tear through his coat but kept moving, driven by righteous fury. Lewis's last shot clicked on an empty chamber just as Matthew reached him. They crashed together in the dust, fighting with knife and fist until Matthew's blade found his former friend's heart. As Lewis died, Matthew saw something like regret flash across his face, a glimpse of the man he'd once been. Andrew appeared as if by magic, helping Matthew gather the crying children. They could hear the Apache scouts regrouping, preparing to attack in force. "There's a trail through the rocks," Andrew said quickly. "If we hurry, we can reach the horses before they cut us off." Matthew nodded, scooping up the youngest child despite his wounded arm. They ran, bullets sparking off the rocks around them, the children stumbling but keeping pace. They reached the horses just as the first Apache warriors crested the ridge. Andrew helped boost the children onto Matthew's horse while providing covering fire with a captured rifle. "Go!" he shouted. "I'll hold them back." Matthew hesitated, unwilling to abandon the young man who'd become like a second son to him. But Andrew's eyes were determined. "The children need you. I know these mountains. I'll find my way back. Now ride." Matthew spurred his horse forward, the other mounts following as they galloped out of the canyon. The children clung to him, faces buried against his coat to escape the wind. Behind them, gunfire continued to echo off the canyon walls. He silently prayed for Andrew's safety as they rode hard for Laredo, knowing the young scout had saved all their lives. Whatever happened next, Matthew had kept his promise. The children would see their families again. The thundering hooves gradually slowed as Matthew guided the exhausted horses into a sheltered arroyo. The children were shivering despite the desert heat, their faces streaked with dust and tears. He helped them dismount, his weathered hands gentle as he lifted each one down. The youngest girl, Grace, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Will Andrew find us?" she whispered. Matthew nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at his gut. The Apache weren't his only concern anymore. Not with his former brothers-in-arms still out there, their betrayal burning like acid in his chest. As the children huddled together beneath a rocky overhang, Matthew studied the terrain. They were still 2 days from Laredo, assuming they could avoid the rogue soldiers. His thoughts drifted to Lieutenant David, once his most trusted friend in the regiment. Now the man was trafficking weapons to hostile tribes, using the chaos to cover his crimes. The revelation had shaken Matthew to his core, forcing him to question everything he'd believed about honor and duty. Night fell swiftly in the desert, bringing a bone-deep chill. Matthew kept watch while the children slept fitfully, wrapped in his spare blankets. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of wind through the scrub brush sent his hand to his revolver. He thought of his own son, lost in these same lands years ago. The memory still cut deep, but something had changed. Working with Andrew had begun to heal wounds he'd thought would never close. Dawn brought the sound of approaching riders. Matthew positioned himself between the children and the arroyo's entrance, rifle ready. But it was Andrew who appeared, leading 3 fresh horses. The young scout was battered but alive, a triumphant grin splitting his dust-covered face. "Borrowed these from some friends," he said, dismounting stiffly. "We'll need the speed. Your former lieutenant and his men are closing in from the north." They rode hard through the morning, taking lesser-known trails that Andrew had learned from his people. The children proved remarkably resilient, understanding the need for silence and speed. Near midday, they spotted dust clouds on the horizon, multiple riders moving fast. "They're trying to cut us off before we reach Laredo," Andrew said grimly. "They know we can expose their operation." Matthew made a decision that went against every instinct he'd developed in 30 years of ranging. "We'll split up," he said, voice rough. "Andrew, take the children east through the box canyon. I'll lead them west." The young scout started to protest, but Matthew cut him off. "You're the only one who knows those paths. Get them to safety. I'll deal with David and his men." The words carried the weight of final judgment. As Andrew led the children away, Matthew took a moment to study the young man who'd become so much more than just a scout. In him, Matthew saw hope for a different future, one where the wounds between their peoples might finally heal. Then he turned his horse west, toward the rising dust cloud. His former brothers in arms wanted blood. They'd soon learn that old rangers died hard. The confrontation came in a sun-bleached wash, where ancient floods had carved deep channels in the earth. Lieutenant David sat his horse at the head of 6 riders, all men Matthew had once called friends. "You're getting slow, old man," David called out, his voice carrying the arrogant certainty of the corrupt. "Where are the children?" Matthew's only response was to ease his rifle from its scabbard. "You know I can't let you reach Laredo," David continued, spreading his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "Too many powerful people involved. Too much money at stake. Step aside, Matthew. You've served your time." The other riders spread out, forming a loose semicircle. Matthew counted weapons, noted positions, felt the weight of years fall away as combat clarity descended. "I've served my time," Matthew agreed, his voice carrying across the wash. "Served with men I trusted. Men who wore the star with pride. But you're not those men anymore." His horse stood rock-steady beneath him, sensing the coming storm. "You're just vultures now, feeding on the chaos you create. And I've got one last lesson to teach about what it means to be a Texas Ranger." The gunfight, when it came, was swift and terrible. Matthew's first shot took David from the saddle before the lieutenant could clear leather. The others returned fire, but Matthew was already moving, decades of experience guiding every action. 2 more went down in the first exchange. The remaining riders scattered, trying to flank him, but the old ranger had chosen his ground well. One by one, they fell to his methodical fire. When silence returned to the wash, Matthew sat bleeding but alive amid the aftermath. He thought of Andrew and the children, hoping they'd made good time toward Laredo. There would be questions, investigations, more battles to come. But for now, he had kept his oath, both to the law he served and to the memory of his son. The future belonged to men like Andrew now. Perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing after all. The moon cast long shadows across the rocky canyon as Matthew Harris and his young Apache companion, David, crouched behind a weathered boulder. Below them, firelight flickered from the abandoned silver mine where the rogue soldiers had made their camp. The acrid smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air from their earlier firefight near Santa Fe, a bitter reminder of how close they'd come to catching John Wright and his band of deserters before losing their trail again. Matthew's joints ached from days in the saddle, but the old Texas Ranger forced himself to stay alert as he studied the camp through his spyglass. The missing children had to be inside that mine, all 5 of them taken from the young family's homestead outside Laredo. His heart clenched thinking of his own son Michael, lost to an Apache raid years ago. But this time was different. This time the real enemies wore army blue. David touched Matthew's arm and pointed to movement near the mine entrance. 2 armed men emerged, their uniforms dirty but unmistakably military. Matthew recognized Andrew King, his former sergeant who'd served with him in the 4th Cavalry before deserting. The other was a younger soldier he didn't know. They were carrying crates, more weapons to sell to the tribes, no doubt. 3 more inside, David whispered, his dark eyes never leaving the camp. Plus Lewis guarding the children. The young scout had proven invaluable over the past week, reading signs Matthew would have missed, and keeping them on Wright's trail when it seemed lost. Matthew had initially resisted working with an Apache, but David's quiet competence had gradually earned his respect. The plan they'd devised was risky. David would create a distraction at the far end of the canyon while Matthew slipped into the mine through a vertical shaft they'd discovered. But first, they needed to deal with the 2 men outside. Matthew checked his Colt revolver. 4 rounds left. It would have to be enough. He couldn't let those children suffer any longer. Dawn was approaching when David melted away into the shadows. Minutes later, the sound of falling rocks echoed from the canyon's far end. King and the other soldier raised their rifles, peering into the darkness. Matthew counted slowly to 10, then began his silent descent toward the mine entrance. His weathered hands found familiar purchase on the rough rock face. Inside the mine, lantern light cast twisted shadows on the timber supports. Matthew moved carefully, testing each step on the creaking boards. Voices drifted from deeper in the tunnel, Wright arguing with someone about payment terms. Then a child's muffled sob made Matthew's blood run cold. He quickened his pace, ignoring the protest of his old wounds. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber where the young children huddled together against the far wall. Grace, the oldest at 12, held her younger siblings close. Their guard, Lewis, sat on a crate nearby, cleaning his rifle. Matthew's finger tightened on the trigger, but he forced himself to wait. One wrong move could get the children killed. Suddenly, shouts erupted from outside, David's diversion working perfectly. Lewis jumped up, looking toward the tunnel entrance. Matthew didn't hesitate. His first shot took Lewis in the chest. The second caught Wright as he emerged from a side passage. But Andrew King was right behind him, firing wildly. Matthew dove behind a support beam as splinters flew. "It's over, Matt," King called out. "Walk away now, and we all live." Matthew could hear the children crying, smell the acrid gun smoke. His response was another carefully aimed shot that caught King in the shoulder, spinning him against the wall. But then Matthew's gun clicked empty. King raised his pistol with his good arm, a cold smile spreading across his face. The shot that killed King came from behind, where David had slipped in through another entrance. The young Apache stood with his rifle still smoking, nodding once to Matthew before moving to check on the children. Outside, the last soldier had fled into the canyon. Matthew sagged against the tunnel wall, suddenly aware of how close they'd come to failure. Dawn found them riding toward Amarillo, the rescued children safely aboard Matthew's wagon. David rode beside them, no longer the reluctant partner but a trusted friend. Matthew watched the young scout point out landmarks to the fascinated children and felt something shift inside him, old wounds beginning to heal. The frontier was changing, he realized. Maybe it was time he changed too. Later, as they shared a meal around the campfire, Grace Young asked David to teach her some Apache words. Matthew smiled, remembering Michael's curiosity about the native peoples. His son would have liked David, he thought. The pain was still there, but somehow lighter now. Tomorrow they would reach Amarillo and return the children to their parents. But tonight, under the vast Texas sky, Matthew Harris finally felt at peace. Victoria Lewis was waiting at the sheriff's office in Amarillo when they arrived. The townspeople gathered to welcome the young children home, and Matthew watched David slip away before the crowds could make him uncomfortable. But the young scout didn't go far. Matthew found him later at the livery stable, preparing his horse for the journey back to his people. "Stay," Matthew said simply. "Could use a partner." David studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. They both knew the frontier was changing, old hatreds giving way to new possibilities. As they rode out together the next morning, Matthew realized that sometimes the greatest journeys weren't measured in miles, but in the distance between hearts. The first year of their partnership proved both men right. Matthew and David tracked outlaws from Santa Fe to Laredo, earning a reputation as an unusual but effective team. The older ranger found himself sharing stories of his son Michael more freely now, while David spoke of his own people's struggles with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Together, they bridged worlds that had seemed forever divided by blood and mistrust. When Victoria Lewis requested their help again in the spring, neither man hesitated. Her work with settler families had uncovered evidence of more weapons being smuggled through Indian territory. The trail led them back to Matthew's old regiment, where Colonel Andrew Preston still commanded, the same man who had covered up the original weapons scandal that had cost so many lives, including Michael's. The dusty streets of Amarillo had changed little, but the town's attitude toward David had shifted. Where once he'd drawn suspicious stares, now shopkeepers and ranchers greeted him with cautious respect. Hannah Young, one of the children they'd rescued, ran out to hug them both when they passed her family's store. Her father, once bitter toward all Indians, now nodded in acknowledgement. Matthew's nightmares of Michael's death grew less frequent, replaced by memories of shared laughter and pride in the man his son had become. David's quiet strength reminded him of Michael in ways that no longer brought pain, just a bittersweet gratitude for the second chance he'd been given to make things right. Some wounds, he learned, healed best when exposed to the light of understanding. Their investigation led them to a remote canyon where Rebecca Martinez, a Mexican trader, told them of seeing soldiers meeting with gun runners under cover of darkness. The pieces fell into place. Colonel Preston wasn't just selling weapons, he was orchestrating raids to create more demand for arms while blaming innocent tribes. The same pattern that had led to Michael's death was being repeated. The confrontation came during a moonless night, with Matthew and David watching Preston's men unload wagons of rifles bound for raiders. When they moved to make arrests, Preston himself appeared, ordering his soldiers to open fire. In the chaos that followed, David saved Matthew's life by taking down a shooter in the rocks above, just as Michael might have done. The firefight ended with Preston wounded but alive, his conspiracy exposed. As dawn broke over the canyon, Matthew found himself facing the man responsible for his son's death. But when Preston sneered about Indian lovers, Matthew simply replied, "My son would be proud of the man who saved my life tonight." The words carried the weight of justice finally served. Back in Amarillo, Victoria helped document Preston's crimes while David's testimony convinced several tribes to help identify the remaining conspirators. The weapons trade that had poisoned the frontier for so long began to crumble. Matthew watched as David spoke with tribal elders and army officers alike, building bridges few had thought possible. Their last stop was Michael's grave, where Matthew introduced David to the son he'd never meet. The young scout stood respectfully as Matthew spoke of Michael's dreams for peace between their peoples. Above them, hawks circled in the endless Texas sky, spirits of the past watching over promises kept and new bonds forged in the crucible of shared purpose. Years later, when asked about the changes along the frontier, Matthew would simply say that peace came not from force of arms, but from force of understanding. He and David continued their work, no longer just partners but family bound by something stronger than blood. The aging ranger had found not redemption, but something far more precious. The hope that had died with his son, reborn in the courage to trust again. As autumn painted the prairie gold, they rode out once more on patrol. Matthew caught David watching him with quiet concern. They weren't young men anymore, but age had given them wisdom enough to know that their greatest legacy wasn't in the battles won or outlaws caught, but in showing others that the distances between hearts could be bridged, one step at a time.